So this is going to be the lecture presentation for Chapter 2. And again, it'll probably be broken down into some chunks so that we don't go over an hour on the video. Chapter 2 is going to cover the chemical foundation of life. And so before you're watching this video, hopefully you have read the chapter and you have completed the vocabulary list assignment as well as the guided chapter outline. Okay, remember when you're doing those guided chapter outlines, you should be reading the book and summarizing what you're reading under each heading. Each heading has a corresponding question on the guided chapter outline. So hopefully those should be finished. You may not have understood everything in the chapter, and in fact the guided chapter outline may have skipped some things in the chapter. But this is what this part of your tasks is for. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give you a lecture on Chapter 2, and hopefully if you have any questions, hopefully we clear those up. If you have any further questions, please don't be afraid to visit office hours or to go ahead and post questions in the discussion or to send me an email. Okay, so why are we talking about chemistry? I thought this was biology. We have to have a basic understanding of chemistry to understand how living organisms work and how they interact with their environment. So having that basic understanding of chemistry is essential to understanding biological systems. And so we're going to talk about chemistry that's really relevant to biological systems. And for those of you who are not taking chemistry this semester, you need this baseline. For those of you who are taking chemistry or who've had taken chemistry in the past, some of this may be a repeat, okay, or a review, which is great. So living organisms like you and me, we are composed of atoms and molecules and macromolecules. There's chemical reactions taking place inside of us that are keeping us alive. And so again, chemistry is important. The most abundant atoms that we find inside of living organisms are carbon. And we're going to learn in this chapter and in the next chapter that carbon is the backbone of all organic molecules. And organic molecules are essential to living organisms. We're going to talk about 4 classes of organic molecules: carbohydrates, nucleic acids, proteins, and lipids. Those are our 4 biologically relevant organic macromolecules. So again, we're going to be talking about those in the next chapter. So carbon, when you hear organic, think carbon. That's one of the most abundant atoms in our bodies, as well as oxygen, hydrogen, and then we have nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. So on this next slide, I want to show you a video, a really cool video of this beetle, the Bombardier beetle. And he's going to have a really cool mechanism for kind of getting rid of predators. To play this, I actually have to pause my show here. And I'm going to open up this other tab and hopefully play it in the full screen mode. Okay.
The Bombardier beetle is one of nature's most improbable creatures. For some, it throws a monkey wrench into the whole idea of evolution. This beetle is a walking powder keg. That cloud you see is the result of a lightning-fast chemical reaction inside his body. When attacked, the beetle sets off the explosion, releasing a boiling hot, stinging poison that sends his enemies running. He can even aim it. This potent mixture inside the beetle is made up of 3 main ingredients. Mix the first 2 of them together and nothing happens, but throw in the third and boom! So the beetle has a trick. He keeps these ingredients separate inside his body. From an evolutionary standpoint, that's what's interesting. In fact, people have been scratching their heads over this for decades. How did this complex system evolve over time? Wouldn't earlier generations of beetles have blown themselves up like a bunch of amateur bomb makers? To some, this beetle's very survival is proof that the whole theory of evolution is wrong. But it turns out there is a way the system could have evolved gradually. Remember that third ingredient? It's an enzyme. It's like a spark. It sets the explosion in motion. And enzymes evolve. At first, maybe this one wasn't so dangerous. But gradually, it became more potent, more specialized, more explosive, as the beetle's body changed to contain it. Scientists at UC Berkeley are trying to figure out how this system came together. They think one of those explosive chemicals evolved from the same raw materials as the beetle's shell. That happens a lot in evolution. It's called exaptation, one body part repurposed for something else. The improbable bombardier beetle, living proof that what doesn't kill you only makes you stronger. Hi again, it's Amy.
So I went ahead and stopped that video, but it's pretty cool. So again, a living organism, right? This beetle who has evolved a mechanism in which to get rid of predators, and it's a chemical reaction. Okay, so you have, two different chemical substances that mix together. There's no reaction that happens, and then all of a sudden, right before it's about to leave the organism's body, there's an enzyme that creates that spark that allows that reaction to actually take place. And so this hot, toxic substance comes out of the tail end of the organism. It's a pretty cool mechanism. And again, it relies on a chemical reaction, which is catalyzed by an enzyme. We're going to talk about enzymes a lot more this semester. Okay, so before we get started, this is the list of learning outcomes. I'm not going to read them all to you, but basically we're going to understand some general basic chemistry. We'll talk about what an atom is, atomic number, atomic mass, isotopes. We'll look briefly at the periodic table of elements, although we're only going to be concerned with some elements. And then we'll look at electron shell diagrams, reactions, and then bonding. Okay, so first off, some basic chemistry, some basic definitions. So you want to make sure that you understand that life is made of matter. And matter is going to be any substance that's going to have mass and take up space. Matter is going to be composed of elements. Okay? Elements have specific chemical and specific physical properties. We say that elements cannot be broken down into smaller substances by ordinary reactions. There are 118 elements on the periodic table, and 98 of those are naturally occurring. The rest are derived in the laboratory. Some terminology here. An element is going to be designated by its chemical symbol, and usually that chemical symbol is going to be a capital letter or a combination of two letters with the first letter being capitalized. So for example, for carbon, it would just be a capital letter C. That would be the atomic symbol. For oxygen, it would be a capital letter O. Okay. For calcium, it's a capital C lowercase a. Okay. Some other ones that you're going to see this semester is hydrogen. Hydrogen is just a capital H. You will also see nitrogen. Nitrogen is a capital H. Phosphorus is a capital P. Okay. Sodium. Sodium's kind of an oddball. Sodium is Na. We will see that when we talk about ionic bonding. So it would be a capital N and a lowercase a. Okay. So those are atomic symbols or chemical symbols for each element. Okay. There are 4 elements that again are very, very prevalent in living organisms. In fact, they make up 96% of the mass of all living things. Those include oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And I gave you the percentages for those elements. So out of that 96%, oxygen makes up 65% of the mass of all living organisms. Okay, so there's our short list. So when we start to talk about biological macromolecules, you're going to see oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Okay. Oh, my little meme here. So the definition of an atom atoms are going to be building blocks of elements. So never trust an atom. They make everything up, right? And so all matter is composed of atoms. So what's in an atom? There's 3 component parts to an atom, and these parts are going to be found in very specific locations in an atom. So we've got protons, we've got neutrons, and we've got electrons. And so all atoms are made up of these 3 subatomic particles, okay? So these are the components, or again, the subatomic particles that make up atoms. So protons are going to carry a positive charge. They also carry a mass of 1. And protons are going to be found in the center of the atom, which we call the atomic nucleus. Not to be confused with the cell's nucleus, right? This is not, the cell's nucleus is going to house DNA. The atomic nucleus just means the center of the atom. And that's where we find these positively charged particles called protons. The other subatomic particle that we also find in the atomic nucleus are neutrons. Neutrons do not carry any charge, and they do have an atomic mass of 1. We'll talk about atomic mass in just a second. Electrons are going to be negatively charged subatomic particles, and these are going to be the only subatomic particle that is not found residing in the atomic nucleus. Instead, electrons are found orbiting the atomic nucleus in very specific locations called orbitals, or for our case, we're going to keep it kind of simple. We're just going to call them shells, okay? Electron shells. Okay. So here's an image showing 3 different atoms. At the very top, we have a hydrogen atom. In the middle, we have an oxygen atom. And at the bottom, we have a sodium atom. And a little piece of the electron shell has been removed so you can see the atomic nucleus as well as the shells. So in our first picture at the very top, hydrogen we're going to see is number 1 on the periodic table. That's its atomic number, which we're going to cover in just a second. What that tells us is that hydrogen has 1 proton. And as long as hydrogen is electrically neutral, if it doesn't carry any charge, it will also have 1 electron. So in an electrically neutral atom, the number of protons and electrons are equal. Okay, so hydrogen, you can see in the very center, there's 1 positively charged particle. And then orbiting that atomic nucleus, we have our 1 negatively charged particle. So 1 proton in the nucleus, 1 electron orbiting in the electron shell. Now, hydrogen does not have any neutrons. Okay, and we're going to get to this in just a second, but that first shell can hold a maximum of 2 electrons. Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind. Let's go down to the second atom that we have on here. It's oxygen. So oxygen, which is going to be number 8 on the periodic table, it has 8 protons in its atomic nucleus, and it also has 8 neutrons in its atomic nucleus. So you can see in the very center here, it says nucleus, right? So in the center here, you've got your red positively charged particles, and you've got your yellow non-charged particles, neutral particles. So there should be 8 protons and 8 neutrons in that atomic nucleus. Okay? We're going to get to this in just a second, but just to kind of start to use the terminology, we would say that oxygen has an atomic number of 8. It's number 8 on the periodic table, which tells us that it has 8 protons. And as long as it's electrically neutral, it will also have an equal number of negatively charged particles, so 8 electrons as well. Its atomic mass, we're going to learn that atomic mass is the sum of the protons and neutrons. So the atomic mass for oxygen is about 16, right? You would just add up the protons and neutrons. Let's look at the electrons. So the electrons, again, there's 8 of them. And so notice how oxygen has more than 1 electron shell. The one closest to the nucleus is called the first shell, and it's going to hold 2 electrons, and those are shown right here. There's 1, and here is the second. Remember, the first shell can hold a maximum of 2 electrons. When we get outside of that, so the second shell here is going to be able to hold 8. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 right now. Okay, it can hold a maximum of 8. So oxygen needs 2 more electrons. Okay, where hydrogen just needed 1 more electron to have a full shell. We'll talk about why that's important in a little bit. To give you a little bit of a precursor to that, atoms like to have full outer shells, we call those valence shells, in order to be chemically stable. So oxygen is going to participate in some type of a chemical reaction to gain 2 electrons. Okay, and oxygen has a tendency to participate in what we call covalent bonding, where it's actually going to share those electrons. More on that to come. Let's look at this last atom down here at the bottom. This is sodium. Sodium's going to be Na, right? It's a atomic symbol or chemical symbol is Na. Sodium is number 11 on the periodic table, which tells us that it has 11 protons. It will also have 11 neutrons in its atomic nucleus. And if it is electrically neutral, if it doesn't carry any charge, it will also have 11 electrons. So let's look at that. In the atomic nucleus here, shown as red spheres and yellow spheres, we have both our positively charged protons and our neutral neutrons. Now, let's look at how those electrons are put in here. The first shell holds 2. 1, 2, that's full. So now we're down to 9 electrons. The second shell is going to hold 8. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's full. Okay, so the first shell and the second shell are full. So that's 10 total electrons. We have 1 more left, so we're going to go out to our third shell, which is going to hold this single solitary electron. We call it a valence electron. Any electrons that are in the outermost shell are called valence electrons. So again, sodium doesn't have a full outermost shell, so it will also participate in chemical bonding. And we're going to get to that in just a minute. Okay. Okay, so we've been talking a little bit about atomic number and atomic mass. I just wanted to make sure that you have the definitions. So again, the atomic symbol or the chemical symbol for an atom is going to be that capital letter, right? So for carbon, it would be capital C. The atomic number is going to be the number of protons that that atom has, okay, or that element has. And in an electrically neutral atom, the atomic number also will indicate the number of electrons. So protons and electrons should be equal if we have an electrically neutral atom. Okay, so atomic number is going to tell us what element that is based on the number of protons it possesses. The atomic mass or the mass number is going to be the number of protons plus neutrons. We don't count electrons here because they have very little mass, so they really don't affect that number. And for protons, the mass of a proton is approximately 1 Dalton. And for neutrons, the same, it's approximately 1. So it's pretty easy to calculate atomic mass. You just literally add up the number of protons and neutrons to give you that number. So how do we write this? I wanted to show you that. So this is sodium. So again, Na here is the chemical symbol for sodium. The atomic number for sodium is 11, and we're going to put that as a subscript to the left of our chemical symbol. And again, that number represents the number of protons, which is always 11 for sodium. Okay, that number 11 tells you it's sodium. The atomic number is going to tell you what element it is. The mass number is going to go up here as a superscript to the left of the chemical symbol. And again, that's going to represent the mass of protons plus neutrons. And that's going to be 23 for sodium. Okay, I want to quickly just introduce you to isotopes and radioisotopes. So isotopes are going to be different forms of an element, okay, that have the same atomic number, so same number of protons, but they're going to have a different atomic mass because the number of neutrons is different. Okay, so an isotope is an element that's going to have the same number of protons, but a different number of neutrons, therefore giving it a different atomic mass. Okay? Sometimes isotopes are what we call radioisotopes. Those would be isotopes that are unstable, and they tend to undergo radioactive decay. When they do that, they emit subatomic particles, and they will actually sometimes change from one element to another. Okay? We can use radioisotopes. In the sciences, we can use them in the lab. We also use them in medicine as tracers. Maybe you've heard of carbon dating. In carbon dating, we're actually comparing the amount of carbon-12 and carbon-14 in whatever substance we're trying to date. Carbon-14 is a radioactive isotope of carbon that will actually spontaneously decay over time, and it has a specific half-life. So we can use that ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 in that substance to actually date that substance back, okay, pretty accurately. Okay. So let me go back here for just a second. I mentioned carbon-12 and carbon-14. They are radioisotopes. Carbon-14 is a radioisotope. But both of those, right, those are isotopes of carbon. So what's the difference between carbon-14 and carbon-12? Both carbon-14 and carbon-12 have the same atomic number, 6. Okay, however, if you look at the mass number, carbon-12 has 6 neutrons, where carbon-14 has 8. Okay, so let's look at that. So we got carbon here. There's my atomic symbol. And carbon's going to be number 6 on the periodic table. So I'm writing the atomic number as a subscript to the left. And we've got carbon-12. And we've got carbon-14. Okay, and so carbon is going to exist as a mixture of these isotopes. And so if we look at carbon-12, if the atomic mass is 12 and the atomic number is 6, that means that this carbon has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. But if we look at carbon-14, still 6 protons, right? It has to have 6 protons to be carbon. But if we look at the mass number, there are 8 neutrons, right? Because 14 minus 6 is 8. Okay? So again, these are called isotopes. Same element, same position on the periodic table, same atomic number, different atomic mass. And why is it different? Because the number of neutrons are different. Okay, let's go to the periodic table. So the periodic table is an arrangement of atoms, or of elements, I should say, based on atomic number. Okay, so they go in order, 1, 2, 3, 4, based on their atomic number. So you can see here, hydrogen is number 1 on the periodic table. It has, its atomic number is 1, meaning that it has 1 proton. And again, if it's electrically neutral, it also has 1 electron. If we come over here all the way to the other side, number 2, element number 2 on our periodic table is helium. Helium has 2, an atomic number of 2 or 2 protons. And it's also going to have 2 electrons. You can also notice that the mass number, the atomic mass for helium is actually written underneath. Okay. And so on the periodic table, we take into account all isotopes of an element. And so that mass number is usually not just one single number. It's usually a decimal. And that's because it's an average of those. Okay. I also want to point something out about helium here. It has 2 protons. It also has 2 electrons. And so helium's outermost shell, the first shell for helium, is going to be full, right? Because it can hold 2 electrons. And so we say that helium, as well as all of the other atoms underneath helium, which would have the same number of valence electrons, they don't have any unpaired or empty shells. Okay, and so these elements here, all the way on the right-hand side of the periodic table, they are inert or unreactive. We call them the noble gases. Okay, these are going to be elements that don't participate in chemical reactions under normal conditions. We can keep going. I want to call your attention to just a couple of important biologically relevant elements. So again, we covered hydrogen. We're going to be working with hydrogen a lot. Carbon is right here, number 6 on the periodic table. Again, notice its mass is not 12 here, it's 12.107, because again, it's going to take into account the isotopes of carbon. Well, we will also find nitrogen in living organisms, which is number 7. We will find oxygen, which is the most abundant, right, atom in living things. So oxygen is number 8 on the periodic table. Phosphorus is number 15. That's going to come into play a little bit here and there. Those are going to be our main atoms that we're going to focus on when we talk about biologically relevant macromolecules. Okay, there are a few others. Sulfur right here, S number 16, but we also find that in organic molecules. Okay. And there are other elements on the periodic table that are important to living organisms, but we're not going to be looking at them in too much detail when we talk about biologically relevant macromolecules. So you can see that the elements are also arranged here. I have a color code, whether they're nonmetals or alkali metals, transition metals, alkaline earth metals, halogens are noble gases. Okay, so they're also arranged based on color. That's going to tell us a lot about reactivity. And so elements are also arranged in rows and also in columns or groups. And so if you look here at, for example, row 2, we've got lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, and neon. This entire row here is going to have the same number of electron shells or orbitals. Okay, so the number of electron shells or orbitals is going to be the same for each element in each row. If we look down in the columns, or groups we can call them, or they're also called families, all of, for example, the elements here in column 14 are going to have 4 valence electrons. Okay, what does that mean? Those are electrons that are found in that outermost shell. So the rows tell us how many shells there are, and again, the columns are going to tell us how many electrons are in those outermost shells. Okay, which is going to tell us, again, a lot about reactivity of the atom. Okay. I don't expect you to memorize the periodic table. The atoms that we will be working with, you'll learn their atomic numbers and you'll learn how to draw their electron shell diagrams. Okay, but over and above that, I don't expect you to memorize this. Okay, so you are going to pause my video presentation right here. You're going to make sure that you have your Are You With Me in Class assessment sheet out and available, and you are going to go ahead and you're going to answer the questions that correspond to the first Are You With Me? So what is matter? What are elements? What is an atom? What are subatomic particles? Tell me what they are, where they're located, what kind of charge they have, what's their mass, what's the atomic number, atomic mass, what are isotopes and radioisotopes? And then again, you're going to go through and just kind of give me a little bit of details about the periodic table of elements. And when you're finished, go ahead and turn me back on. And we'll go ahead and we'll go through some questions here. So some questions just to make sure that we're all together here. So question number 1. If xenon has an atomic number of 54 and a mass number of 108, so hold on, let's take a look at that. So if we have xenon, I think xenon is Xe, I'm not positive, but, ooh. Should have picked something easier like carbon, which I know. So xenon, if it has an atomic number of 54, hopefully you know we're going to write that right here. as a subscript to the left of the atomic symbol. And then if it has an atomic mass of 108, we're going to write that up here. Okay, ooh, hopefully you can see that, as a superscript right to the left of that atomic symbol. I want you to get used to writing that. So the question is, how many neutrons does it have? So let me give you a minute to try to figure that out. Okay, so hopefully you took the atomic mass and you subtracted from it the atomic number, right? Because the mass number is going to equal the number of protons plus neutrons. We're looking for neutrons. We know that the atomic number represents the number of protons. So it's just going to be 108 minus 54, right? So the mass minus the number of protons will give you the number of neutrons. And that's going to be 54. Second question. Potassium. Potassium has an atomic number of 19. What is its electron configuration? Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and we're going to figure out where the electrons would be in the shells, right, or orbitals that are surrounding the atomic nucleus. Okay, so let's try this together. So first off, potassium has an atomic symbol of K. So I'm going to, it's not working for me. I'm going to put a K right in here to represent the nucleus. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start to draw shells. So I'm going to draw my first shell or orbital here, trying to get it to be a circle. Okay, we know that the first shell of all atoms is going to hold a maximum number of 2 electrons. So go ahead and put those 2 electrons in. I like to put them in as a pair. This isn't working so good for me. Okay, hold on. I have a different color pen. Hopefully this works a little bit better here. So I'm going to put 1 in here. Maybe. 1 in right there. Okay, and here's the second one. So there's 2 electrons in the first shell. Okay, so I started with 19. I put 2 in. I got 17 left to go. So now I have to make a second shell. Let me grab my black pen back. So here is my second shell or orbital, right? This is where electrons reside. These also represent energy levels. Okay, so electrons, the farther out they are from the atomic nucleus, kind of the more energy that they have. And so electrons like to be low energy, so they're going to occupy the shells closest to the atomic nucleus first. But if a shell is full, there's no room for any more electrons. So I can't put any more in the first shell because the first shell can only hold 2. In the second shell, I can put a maximum of 8. And the way I'm going to do this kind of represents how they actually sit in orbitals. I'm going to put each electron in one at a time in 4 locations. Okay, so once I have 4 in, I'm going to start to pair them up. So here we go. I got 1 electron in one position, 2 electrons in my second position, 3, maybe not, 3 in my third, and here is my fourth. Okay, I put 4 more in, so I got 13 left. Okay, so, right, 4, 5, 6, yep, 13 left. So here is another one. I'm going to put it in as a pair. Okay, so there, now I have 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, it's hard to write on the computer. So now I have 8 electrons in my second shell. That's it. I can't hold any more. And so I've put in a total of 10 electrons. I still have 9 left. Okay, so I need to draw another shell. And again, as I go further out from the atomic nucleus, this is a higher energy level as well. Okay, so there's shell number 3. And shell number 3 is going to also hold 8. And how many do I have left? 9. So I know that this shell is going to be full as well. So let me go ahead and put those in. I'm going to put all 8 that it can hold in. 1, 2. I'm going to put them in one at a time in 4 locations. 3, 4. And for those of you who are chemistry majors, you know why, right? Because of the orbitals. It's okay. Okay, so now my first, second, and third shells are all full. I got to draw a fourth shell because I still have an electron left. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my black marker, and I'm going to draw my fourth shell. It is hard to draw on the computer. And get my red one back. And now I just have one electron to put in. I'll put it in right here. Okay? So, let's see here, the answers. So the first one says shells 1, 2, and 3. No. Shells 1 and 2 are full and 3 has 9 electrons. No. Shells 1, 2, and 3 are full and shell 4 has 3 electrons. No. Green says 1, 2, and 3 are full and 4 has 1 electron. Yep. Let's just check the last answer. Yellow says shells 1, 2, and 3 are full and no other electrons are present. Well, that's not true. There was one left. So we're going to go with green here. Okay. There are going to be some questions like this on your quiz and on your exam, so you want to make sure that you understand how to do that. Let's go on. Okay. So the next section here. So we know what elements are, we know what atoms are, we know what atomic number and atomic mass, how to find those. We have a good idea of what the periodic table looks like, and we understand what isotopes and radioisotopes are. Okay? And we even did an electron shell diagram just then. So let's talk about molecules. Molecules are going to be when 2 or more atoms come together and they chemically react or bond with each other. Okay? How they bond depends on the atoms that are going to be coming into play here. It depends on the atom's electrons. Okay? Okay. So we just did this with with potassium. The electron shell diagram, or the Bohr model, we can call this. This is going to show us where electrons are in an atom. We know that protons and neutrons reside in the atomic nucleus and that electrons orbit the atomic nucleus, but where do they orbit the nucleus? In which shell? So the first shell, the shell closest to the atomic nucleus, we can either call it the first shell or the first energy level, or we can call it the 1n. Okay, all of those are fine. The second shell would be the 2n, or the second energy level. The third shell would be the 3n, or the third energy level. And remember, again, as a rule, the first shell can hold a maximum of 2 electrons. And then if we're talking about the third or fourth shell, they're going to follow the second or third shell, they're going to follow the octet rule, where they hold a maximum of 8 electrons. Okay? And again, electrons will fill shells closest to the atomic nucleus first. That's where they're going to reside. Because electrons like to be at the lowest energy level. Okay? Okay, let's go to the next slide. I think I have. Okay. So let's look at some Bohr models, or electron shell diagrams. So first off, the outermost shell that has electrons residing in it is called the valence shell. And the valence shell might be full, but if it's not full, then the atom, we say, is going to be reactive. Okay? The valence electrons are going to be those electrons that reside in the outermost shell. And if those valence electrons, again, are unpaired, so if the shell's not full, there's going to be some unpaired valence electrons, then the atom is not going to be stable. It's going to have to react in order to gain stability. So let's take a look here. And this is great. So this is the periodic table, but really condensed, just showing a couple of elements. But it has period 1, or the first row, I should say, either way. You can see that both hydrogen and helium reside there, and both of them only have 1 electron shell. Okay, and that is the valence shell as well. If we look at period 2, you can see that lithium, carbon, fluorine, and neon, all of these here, have 2 electron shells. Period 3 here, containing sodium, silicon, chlorine, and argon, all have 3 electron shells. Okay, so you can see how elements are, again, arranged in the periodic table based on the number, in rows, based on the number of electron shells. So the first period would have just 1 shell, the second row or period would have 2 shells, and the third would have 3 shells. We can also see how they are arranged in groups based on the number of valence electrons in that outermost shell. So for group 1, hydrogen, lithium, and sodium all have 1 valence electron. If we look over here in group 18, well, all of the atoms here have a full valence shell. So for helium, that's just 2 electrons in that first shell, but for everybody below it, it's going to be 8 valence electrons. Oh, there's a little typo here. Argon should have a second electron here. That should be full. Okay, it's a little typo in the book. Group 14 is going to have 4 valence electrons. Okay, so both carbon as well as silicon have a valence of 4. Okay, that means that they have 4 unpaired or lone electrons in that outermost shell. They're going to participate, you're going to see carbon is going to participate in 4 covalent interactions. If we come back here to group 1, notice lithium and sodium, for example. To get a full valence shell, they would have to gain 7 electrons each. They have a tendency not to do that. Atoms with a low number of electrons or a high number of electrons are going to tend to participate in what we call ionic bonding. They're going to give up or gain electrons. Okay, they're not going to participate in covalent bonding. Except for hydrogen. That's an exception. Hydrogen only needs 1 more electron to fill its valence shell, and so it will actually participate in covalent interactions. Okay, we're going to get into covalent and ionic bonding in a few minutes. So again, group 1 has 1 valence electron in that outermost shell. Group 14 would have 4. Group 17 is going to have 7. Okay, so both fluorine and chlorine here have 7 valence electrons. Only 1 unpaired. Okay. Okay. So again, from this slide, you want to make sure you understand that the valence shell is the outermost shell, and valence electrons are those electrons that are in that valence shell. Any unpaired electrons they're gonna let us know that the element or the atom is going to be reactive. A full valence shell tells us that the atom is stable or non-reactive. Okay, so we're going to get into a little bit of bonding here. Okay, so again, make sure that you understand that an element, its goal is to reach stability. And elements are going to be most stable when their valence shell is full. Either 2 electrons if it's that first shell, or 8 electrons if it's outermost shells. So how do they achieve this? Atoms will participate in bonding, chemical bonding, with other atoms to achieve this. So for example, we've got here 1 atom of hydrogen, a second atom of hydrogen. Both of these have 1 valence electron. They both need 2. Here's oxygen. Oxygen has 6 valence electrons. 2 of those electrons are unpaired. And so this electron here on oxygen and this electron here on hydrogen will be shared. That's shown over here. And the same thing is going to happen. This electron of this hydrogen and this electron of oxygen will also be shared, and that's shown here. So you can see that in this molecule that's just been formed, it's a molecule of water, and the electrons here are being shared between oxygen and hydrogen, and the electrons here are also being shared between oxygen and hydrogen. This is a molecule of water, or H2O. Okay. So we're going to come back to bonding in just a second. I just want to introduce you quickly to chemical reactions. When we talk about bonding, bonding is the result of a chemical reaction. When we look at a chemical reaction, there's going to be participating atoms or molecules on the left-hand side of the arrow, and we're going to call those the reactants. Those are going to be the substances that are going to participate in the reaction. Again, they're on the left of the equation. On the other side of the equation, so we're going to draw an arrow in between these, we're going to find products. And the products are what is being produced in the reaction. So we're going to have reactants. Let me get my pen here. Reactants, and then an arrow leading to products. Okay, now some reactions are going to be reversible, and if they're reversible, you would usually see an arrow that looks like this going in that direction as well. Okay, and then there's some reactions that are irreversible. So a reversible reaction can proceed in both directions. Maybe not at an equal rate, but it can go in both directions. An irreversible reaction is going to proceed in one direction. And that's usually because the products that are being formed are going to be used. They're going to kind of go away. Dynamic equilibrium, just to introduce you to that, that's in a reversible reaction, and that's when the forward and the reverse reactions occur at equal and consistent rates. Okay, so we call that dynamic equilibrium. Okay, so let's get back to bonding. So one type of bonding that we're going to look at is ionic bonding. Okay, and in order to form an ionic bond, you have to first form ions. So ions are required for ionic bonding. So there's two types of ions. We've got positively charged ions called cations, and we have negatively charged ions called anions. Okay, so some atoms that have a low number or a high number of valence electrons, so atoms that have just maybe 1 or 2 or 7 valence electrons, they're going to tend to participate in ionic bonding. They're going to tend to form ions. So positively charged ions or cations, these are going to form when an atom gives up or donates an electron. So for example, we took a look at potassium. Remember, that was the one that had 19 electrons, and we drew the electron shell diagram. We got to the fourth shell, and there was just 1 electron sitting in there. So potassium has a valence of 1, just a single lone electron out there in the fourth shell. So potassium has a tendency to give that electron up or to donate it. And when it does that, it loses a negatively charged particle. And so therefore it has 1 extra positive proton in the nucleus. If we compare the number of protons to electrons, there's going to be 1 more proton than electron now. And so it becomes a positively charged ion or a cation. Okay? An anion is going to be the opposite of that. So an anion, again, is going to be a negatively charged ion. That's going to form when an atom gains an electron. So now it's going to have 1 extra electron orbiting the atomic nucleus. And so it's going to have a negative charge. 1 more negative electron than it has positive protons in the atomic nucleus. Okay, we're going to look at an example of this in just a second on the next slide, where we're going to look at sodium, which is going to become a cation, and chlorine, which is going to gain an electron and become chloride, and it will be negative. Okay, once we have a positive and a negative ion, next we're going to have an attraction, right? Because oppositely charged particles are attracted to each other. That's the bond. So when we say ionic bond, we're talking about the attraction between oppositely charged ions. So let's take a look here. Here is the textbook example of the ionic bond. So the first thing that has to happen is ions have to form. So here's sodium. Okay, the chemical symbol for sodium is Na. we put the electrons in its shells. It has its atomic number is 11, so it's going to have 11 electrons, so 2 in the first shell, 8 in the second, and 1 in the third. Okay, one lone electron, it's going to have a tendency to give that up. Here is chlorine. Its atomic symbol is Cl. It's going to have 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 in the second, and 7 in the third. It just needs one more. And so sodium is going to donate its electron to chlorine. This becomes chloride. And now it has 1 extra electron, so it becomes negatively charged. Negatively charged. And sodium lost an electron, so now it has 1 less electron, so it's got a positive charge. And sometimes atoms can lose or gain 2 electrons. Okay, so it's not always just 1. In this case, it's just 1. So after we form ions, remember this would be a cation, positively charged, and our chloride here would be an anion, negatively charged. They're going to be attracted to each other. Opposite charges attract. When that happens, which is shown here, we end up with sodium chloride, which we call NaCl, or you know it as salt. Common table salt, this is. Okay? Now, think about common table salt. In its shaker, you can see it. It's a white crystalline structure. Okay, that's a bunch of ionic molecules that are now all kind of attracted and set up in a crystalline-like structure. It's a pretty strong interaction, right? However, when you put salt into water, what happens? It dissolves, right? So all ionic compounds, they're pretty strong outside of water, those bonds, but when you put those compounds into water, right, we call that an aqueous environment, a watery environment, those ionic bonds are going to break. Okay? Shown here, where's my pointer? NaCl, which is our salt, right, sodium chloride. If we put that into water, and you've done this, picture it, you put salt into water, it magically disappears. Oh, it's still there. It's just that the ions here are going to become separated and surrounded by water. So we end up with NaCl separated. Okay, here is a reaction. Right, we've got our reactant molecule on the left-hand side, we have our arrow, and we have our products on the right. Okay, it's going to become dissociated or separated in water. Okay, so that's an ionic bond. The other type of bond I really want you to learn about are covalent bonds. Covalent bonds are stronger than ionic bonds because they do not break in water. They don't break in aqueous environments. And they are more common in biological molecules. So when we talk about biological macromolecules, we're going to talk about covalent bonding. Is there any ionic interactions that happen? Yeah, sort of, kind of. But there's not full ionic bonds, more interactions. And covalent bonds are much more prevalent. Okay? What is a covalent bond? So electrons are not shifted from one atom to another. Instead, electrons are shared between 2 atoms. And there could be a single pair of electrons being shared. That would be a single covalent bond. Or if there's 2 pairs of electrons being shared, we call that a double covalent bond. Or even 3 pairs of electrons can be shared between 2 participating atoms. That would be a triple bond. Water is a great example of a covalent molecule. The bonds between hydrogen and oxygen, shown here, represent the sharing of those 2 electrons. So those electrons are going to orbit the atomic nucleus of both hydrogen as well as oxygen. And this single line here, if you look at the structural formula down here, okay, you're going to get used to drawing structural formulas in lab next week, you can see that the bond is represented by one single line or dash between those. If it were a double bond, it would be just 2 lines. If it were a triple bond, it would be 3 lines. Okay, so this line right here represents the sharing of a pair, 2 electrons between those 2 atoms. Now, covalent bonds can be nonpolar or polar. What does that mean? In a nonpolar covalent bond, the electrons being shared are shared equally between the 2 atoms. In a polar covalent bond, the electrons are shared unequally, which means that the electrons are going to spend more time orbiting the atomic nucleus of just one of the atoms participating in that interaction. Water is a great example of a polar molecule. The bonds between oxygen and hydrogen are going to be polar covalent bonds. Oxygen has a much higher, what we call electronegativity than hydrogen. And so what does that mean? That means that oxygen has a greater pull, a stronger pull on the electrons that are being shared. And so the electrons being shared between oxygen and hydrogen are going to spend more time hanging out with oxygen, with its atomic nucleus, and less time orbiting hydrogen's atomic nucleus. So that's a polar covalent bond. And that's going to become really important when we start to talk about water, which is the next part that we're going to. If we look at methane here, methane is going to be an organic compound that you're going to look at. It's CH4, so 1 carbon and 4 hydrogens, and each hydrogen is going to share a pair of electrons with carbon, and it's going to be shared pretty equally. That's a nonpolar covalent bond. Okay? Okay. That brings us here. Oh, actually, let me back up one slide. I want to talk about polarity here. So if we look, this is kind of small, so I'm going to redraw it. So if we look at water, here's oxygen, and it's going to share a pair of electrons with 2 hydrogen atoms. So here's one, and here is the other. Okay? So we said that those electrons being shared are going to spend more time with oxygen than hydrogen. And so oxygen doesn't steal the electrons. We don't have any ionic things going on. Okay? Oxygen doesn't become negatively charged. However, because the electrons spend more time with oxygen, we say that oxygen gains a partial negative charge. So that little symbol there means partial. And these hydrogen atoms are going to become partially positive. They're not fully charged. They didn't give up their electrons, but they're partially positive. So what happens is water molecules like this one are going to have polarity. They're going to have regions that have different charge. Oxygen's going to be partially negative, and hydrogen's going to be partially positive. Well, that's important. Let's look here at the next slide. Because of that, because of the polarity of the water molecule, what's going to happen is it will be attracted to other molecules that are either charged or have polarity themselves. So here are 5 molecules of water in this figure. The red represents oxygen and the white is representing hydrogen. And you can see the oxygen is partially negative. Oh, this water molecule here, its hydrogen is partially positive. So there's going to be an attraction. This dotted line represents an attraction. It's not a covalent interaction. It's not even an ionic interaction. Instead, it's an attraction that we call the hydrogen bond. Okay, and in biology and in our textbooks, we call it the hydrogen bond. Chemists don't love it. They like to call it an interaction. We call it a hydrogen bond. Now, hydrogen bonds are a weak interaction, but collectively, if you have a lot of hydrogen bonds, they're actually pretty strong. Okay, they build up in time and space. They can be broken and reformed, depending on temperature, depending on the energy in the system. Okay, so in this particular example, this water molecule is bonded, hydrogen bonded, to the maximum number of other water molecules, which is 4. Okay, which is going to become important in the next part that we're going to get into. Okay, so between water molecules, there can be hydrogen bonds. There can be hydrogen bonds within biological molecules, like within proteins and within DNA. Okay, actually, this is pretty neat. So you've all probably heard of DNA. It's a double-stranded helical molecule. Well, the 2 strands of DNA, they're held together in the middle purely by hydrogen bonds, which makes the molecule able to be unzipped and rezipped because you can break and form those bonds really easily. Okay, so if you take Bio 2 with me, we'll talk more about hydrogen bonds and how they hold DNA together. Okay, so here is your second Are You With Me? And I'm going to actually I'm gonna let you pause this and answer these, and then come back. We'll answer the couple of questions here, and then we'll stop this video right there. So pause me, answer those. Okay, so now we're back. So let's get these questions answered really quick, and then we'll end this video and I'll make a new one for the next section. So first question, what type of bond represents a weak chemical bond? Hydrogen bonds, atomic bonds, covalent bonds, or nonpolar covalent bonds? So covalent bonds, whether they're polar or nonpolar, they are strong. A weak bond would be the hydrogen bond. Remember, they're going to form and break relatively easily. Second question. A covalent chemical bond is one in which, okay, so red, electrons are removed from one atom and transferred to another atom so that the two atoms become oppositely charged. Blue, protons and neutrons are shared between two atoms as to satisfy the requirements of both atoms. Green, valence shell electrons of two atoms are shared so as to satisfactorily fill the outer electron shell of both atoms. Or yellow, valence shell electrons of one atom are transferred to fill the inner electron shell of another atom. Hopefully you answered green. Okay, when you hear covalent, you're thinking sharing. Okay. Next question. Which bond or interaction would be difficult to disrupt or break when a compound is put into water? Covalent bond, hydrogen bond, van der Waals interactions, which we didn't talk about, or ionic bonds. So hopefully you answered red, covalent bonds. Okay. Next question. What results from an unequal sharing of electrons between atoms? Unequal, is that nonpolar, polar covalent bonds, ionic bonds, or radioactive decay? Okay, so an unequal sharing is going to give you a polar covalent bond, and it's going to result in polarity. Okay, so unequal, polar. Okay, so stop this video here and I'll start the next section on a new video.